Hello and welcome to Project Supercar. In the last episode I spoke about setting up the drive shafts, but before we go into that I think it might be a good idea to talk about the chassis that I chose to build for this car. Here's the donor car, all nice and dry. I'm glad I put it in the carport because it was absolutely chucking it down last week. In fact, I think it's going to be raining today as well. This junk pile is getting a bit big and it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. Hello internet, it's me again. Here I am talking into the camera and trying not to look awkward. I think I just failed with that, didn't I? Let's take a moment to talk about the different types of chassis that I could have chosen for this build. There are about 4 basic types of chassis. I know there's variations on chassis and I really don't have time to get into that, so we'll just cover the 4 basics. The first type of chassis, or possibly the original chassis, is what is referred to as a ladder chassis, ladder frame chassis. These are typically used on older cars. A ladder frame would be built and then the body would rest on the frame. One example would be like the Corvette Stingray. Ladder frame chassis have their purpose, and if I was building a hot rod or something like that, that would be my first choice. But I'm not, I'm building a supercar, so I need a different type of chassis. But let's just take a quick look at what a hot rod chassis, a ladder frame chassis, typically looks like.
The frame was then cut free from the table and set on the ground so we could bolt up our front suspension. The VersaCut 60 was used to cut out the original floor from the body so it could be channeled over the frame. With the body set on the frame, we rolled the rear axle under the body and cut notches in the wheel wells so we could set the rear ride height. Height measurements were then taken from the floor to the top of the rear crossmember and from the top of the frame rails to the top of the crossmember to determine the size of the rear frame step. We also measured the distance from the center of the front hub to the center of the back hub to determine our final wheelbase for the car. In the beginning of this video, we started with a pile of old Ford parts and a bunch of box tubing, and now, well, look at it. We got a pretty killer rolling chassis, and it's very strong. All I have to do is dress up a couple of the welds and add a center cross member, and we have a completed rolling chassis. Next, we're going to build a floor for the body so that it sits down over the chassis and bolts on like factory. If you want to follow this build or any of our other builds, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit eastwood.com to get the tools you need to do the job right. Modern day cars don't use ladder frame chassis anymore. They have a single monocoque chassis, sometimes referred to as the unibody. These chassis are pressed steel or aluminium metal sheets that are then welded together to make the body form, a bit like this.
Monocoque or unibodies don't have to be made from steel or aluminium. Some have been made out of fiberglass. For example, the Lotus Elite Type 14. That is a fiberglass monocoque chassis with two subframes, one supporting the engine and the front suspension and one supporting the rear suspension. But this type of chassis is no good. I clearly can't afford to have pressed steel panels welded together. That's not something a DIYer can do. And the fiberglass monocoque chassis, that's fine if you've got small power, light car, but I'm hoping to have something like 600 brake horsepower in this thing, maybe with some big turbos and some tuning. So that isn't going to work for me. Can't really have a fiberglass monocoque chassis. Another type of chassis which sort of solves the fiberglass monocoque issue with the strength is a backbone chassis. These are usually found in Lotus and TVRs. They have a backbone chassis and then the fiberglass body is then placed on top. Let's take a quick look at one.
Guess how many of them captured this special moment in the car build? Just the one. Now there were 7 of us, and with 7, not one of us felt any kind of weight here at all. I reckon you could do this with 4 people, but I think the more the merrier and the better for the car, because you don't want any one area of the car getting too much pressure put on it. Now the guys at Delta, they didn't think much of this chassis design. They thought it was kind of agricultural, but you know, backbone chassis, I think, are very cool things. And you might think, well, where's the side impact? Well, Lotus cars even earlier than this one, in the mid-70s, were winning awards even over Volvo for safety. Their crash impact was incredible. By comparison to modern composite cars, these Lotus fiberglass bodies are way thicker. They make cars like the Elise seem like it's made of paper. Anyway, it doth sound like I protest too much. I love this thing and couldn't care less what anybody else thinks of it, because I think there's beautiful geometry in this chassis. And the little boy trapped inside this man's body just sees a radio controlled car with the shell taken off it.
Now I could have gone with this, but there's some limitations to the backbone chassis as well. On my particular car, I wanted some crash protection on the sides, and there was other issues that I wanted to solve. I mean, for example, Lotus and TVR bolt the seats straight through the floor. This leaves an exposed bolt which can leak, rust, and you can't get the seats out. And for me, if you've got the seat that's bolted to a fiberglass monocoque, which is then bolted to a chassis, you're going to lose a little bit of feel in the driving. And it's very minute. Some of you might understand what I mean. So in my car, I wanted the seat, in fact everything, the seat, the steering wheel, the pedals, everything structural, to be bolted to a steel chassis. One of my goals was to make sure that none of the fiberglass panels were structural, that they didn't support any weight. The doors, as you might see in the picture, they're currently up. They're not supported by fiberglass, they're bolted directly to a steel chassis. The hinges, about here, for the rear clamp, that's also bolted to a steel chassis. There's nothing, virtually nothing on this car that requires fiberglass as a structural member. So I chose to do a space frame chassis, very similar to the Noble. Let's take a look at one.
Yeah, in engineering development, basically what we do is we create the models on the CAD package, and from those we would then create the drawings. From the drawings it would then go out to the shop and they'd make the first couple of prototypes, maybe a couple of changes here and there. And from that, once we're happy with the design and the function of the part, we would then manufacture jigs, fixtures, whatever the guys in production would need to manufacture the part. We would check those parts, see how they fit in the vehicle, do a couple of tests, whatever's necessary to ensure that the part is correct, and then once we're happy with that final product, then we would issue it out to production.
Well, once all the body work is finished with latches in, windows in, fitted 100%, on a dolly on the chassis, the way it's going to sit when it's finished. It's ready to go to the next stage, and what they do now is they take it to the prime shop and they use the high build primer to make sure, and then it gets block sanded. Wait until you see that next week.
So my chassis is very similar to a modern Lamborghini, except that the modern Lamborghini has a space frame chassis, but in the centre there is a carbon fibre tub. So instead of the carbon fibre tub, something I can't afford, the space frame chassis goes completely through the centre of the car, if that makes sense. Now I decided what type of chassis I was going to build, we can now get back to the drive shafts. On the original Audi donor car, the gearboxes for the Quattro and the front wheel drive are slightly different. I don't know if you can quite tell in this picture, but the drive shaft flanges are also different, because on the Quattro the CV joint is much stronger and the drive shaft is much bigger, whereas on the front wheel drive gearbox they have a more weaker sort of CV joint, which is like a tripod style CV joint, and the drive shafts are smaller. The problem I had was I couldn't bolt the Quattro front drive shafts onto the front wheel drive gearbox because the flanges don't fit. I mean, you could pull the flanges, you can get into that sort of thing, but the other issue I had is I wanted to increase the track, push out the width of the car, and I wanted to make the drive shafts a little longer. Also, in the back of my mind, before I started this project to build my own supercar, I thought, if I ever finish it, and there's loads of hurdles I've got to get over first before I can finish it, but if I ever finish it, I thought I'd have a set of molds, and maybe one of you guys might want to build one. Someone come up and say, oh, could I build one? So I sort of tried to develop this supercar to become a kit, or more like a component car. So in the back of my mind I always thought, what if I finished it, and what if I could convert this into a kit so others could build one? So I was always thinking that. Everything on this chassis has been documented, every part has been measured, and it's all in my computer, so the chassis can be replicated very easily. With that in mind, I had to think about the drive shafts, and I thought I'd come up with a solution that would solve the problem with the flange and the CV joint not fitting, and push the drive shafts out 10 centimeters. So I came up with a spacer. What I was trying to do was avoid cutting the drive shafts. That's something a DIY really shouldn't be doing. That's for the professionals, and it's also quite expensive. I might have to do that in the long run anyway, especially if I go turbo on this thing and I change the gearbox again, because this is a 5-speed and I'm going to put a 6-speed in there. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I thought I'd do sort of an experiment, and I'd come up with a spacer, so that a spacer would be supplied with the kit, and then someone could easily just bolt that onto the gearbox and then just bolt the drive shafts on. Let's take a look on the car and I'll show you what I mean. Oh dear, this thing's a bit filthy. It has been sitting for a while. I think I'm going to have to give this a clean. There you go, just give it a quick cat lick, nothing special, just make it look a little bit better. You know, the funny thing is my missus says this thing's lost its sucking power since I last used it. I don't know why. I says, well, that's funny, because most women, they lose their sucking ability after they get married. So let's take a closer look at the spacer on my rear drive shafts. So what we have here is a front-wheel drive Audi high-speed gearbox and the front drive shafts from an Audi Quattro. And there's the spacer there. So this bolts onto the larger flange, and then the CV joint bolts onto that. And because there's two either side, and this is just over 5 centimeters wide, it pushes the track out so that the hub and the wheel is actually pushed out. So there's no need to have any wheel spacers. Okay, you could probably see a wheel spacer there, but this wheel is for mock-up purposes, and the final wheel will be dished. So this part of the wheel will move in. The offset will be more into the center of the wheel where it should be. So all that spacer is doing is making up the difference for the offset. So that's not part of the kit, and I wouldn't advise anyone doing that, not if you're running big power. Now, one thing I wanted to get right is I wanted the drive shafts to be parallel with the lower wishbones. What I didn't want was some crazy angles on the drive shaft that would wear out the CV boots prematurely. So the drive shaft is 90 degrees with the rear wheel. Once I had the wishbone and the hub set up, and now I knew the length of the drive shaft, I could then calculate using the upper link on the hub, I could then calculate the width of my chassis. Now again, because this is a DIY build, I am limited on how much machine work I can do myself. I mean, this is my machine shop. Now I know some of you Yanks out there will probably have a Bridgeport and a lathe and a milling machine and everything all set to go in your basement. Well, sorry, we don't have that in the UK, so my only choice was to get a machine shop to do the work for me. To have the spacer made, I drew up a drawing. This was my first ever drawing when I was building this. This is the first one. One thing you need to do is, if you're going to do a drawing for a machine shop, make it as clear as possible for them. It helps them in the long run. Now, for the brackets on this car, I have two types of brackets: critical, non-critical. The non-critical brackets I can make myself, because if they're slightly out, it's not going to matter that much. Brackets for holding water bottles, that sort of thing. Non-critical brackets. Suspension brackets, on the other hand, are very critical. You've got to get those right. And if you don't have the drilling machines and all the equipment, I wouldn't advise you doing it by hand, not on something that could do 150 or more miles an hour. I'm a big fan of water jet technology. So a lot of the brackets on this car are cut out from steel using water jet technology. A bit like this.
Do we need to sharpen it? Have you even hit the board? You're hitting like the wood case around it.
So once my brackets came back from the water jet company, I could lay out the first pieces of steel. I think I'll do for now, and in the next episode I'll show you how I laid out the chassis and made it true. This is pretty critical, you've got to get it true. So that'll do for now. See you in the next one. Bye.